In a short podcast, it's impossible to cover all the major turning points in the economic history of Wales. And there's always a debate about what's economically important. For example, while Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries was a big historical event, as it wrestled power back from locations outside London, I didn't look into it in the last episode, since the effect on general economic relationships doesn't strike me as especially significant. Even at a local level, the economic effect wasn't very significant for most people. At Tintern Abbey, for example, local trade continued much as it done before, with markets occurring in and around the increasingly robbed-out ruins of the abbey. Likewise, you will note that in this episode that I'm going to go from the Tudor period that petered out at the turn of the 1600s and jump to the 1700s and the Industrial Revolution, thereby skipping past the English Civil War of 1642 to 51. In fact, it's worse than that, as I'm going to leave out the huge political changes that the rise of parliamentary democracy brought from the 1600s until the 1900s, as in the next episode I want to focus on the rise of the welfare state in the 1900s, when capitalism gave way to an element of socialism, as I think that was the biggest change Parliament has ever brought to basic economic relations. The ideas behind the welfare state go back at least as far as the Civil War, and in particular people like John Lilburne and other levellers, and were further developed in the Industrial Revolution that we're looking at today. But as the big impact comes later, I'm going to say no more about this in today's episode. So, what changed in the 1700s? The Industrial Revolution began in northern England and spread across the world due to a combination of broad geographical, economic, social and legal reasons, as well as some great individual acts of genius that relate both to unique individual brilliance, but also, again, to broader technological and scientific changes that meant that technological innovation was both more feasible and increasingly it was seen as a route to fame and fortune, at a time when there were very few other routes to social mobility, with sons generally doing what their dads did, although ironically technological progress would often put paid to many such traditional crafts. There is a debate about what really started this revolution, but it seems to start in one place, which makes it feel like it's something that you could have actually gone and seen happening. And that's what Adam Smith, being born in 1723 and dying in 1790, claimed to have done. With a pinch of salt in hand, the story I tell about this is to imagine you're a blacksmith in the north of England. You spend most of your day making tools and horseshoes and mending stuff. But you can also make a bit of extra money by extruding a bit of metal into pins. Don't think tiny modern pins though. Think bigger, dressmaking pins and needles. There are a number of stages in pin making, but it's not as skilled as making a sword. And if you can get a few of the people thrown off their land that we mentioned earlier in other episodes of this podcast, who will work for virtually nothing to help with some of the basic tasks, this could prove profitable. So you're motivated to divide the job up even more, so that the unskilled ex-peasants can do more of the tasks until eventually your skilled input is no longer required at all. And what you created in effect is a pin manufactory or factory of the sort Adam Smith claimed to have visited, in which 48,000 pins are made each day by an assembly line of 10 essentially unskilled people, which is far more than 10 skilled blacksmiths working alone could do, since working alone you'd be lucky to make 20 in a day. Also, it becomes increasingly easy to substitute capital for labour when the labour is doing something simple that a simple machine could do, like snipping the hot metal into uniform lengths. Indeed, I would argue that it also becomes easier to create inventions, as I can easily see someone in the 1700s making a chopping machine and an extruding machine, whereas I can't imagine them making a full-blown automatic pin-making machine. And of course, many of the wonders we see around us today, like phones, cars and TVs, are accumulations of many, many simpler inventions. Dividing the job up proves to be fantastically productive, and we now live in a world in which we all specialise in doing a little bit of what needs to be done. It works well, although it does mean that many types of jobs come and go, with the going bit being more newsworthy than the job creation part, which is often harder to spot. Although currently, with AI, it's difficult to find out what jobs are being lost as well as what jobs are being created. The other drawback that Smith identified was that compared to skilled craft work, specialised jobs can be boring and unfulfilling, possibly leading to a degree of what Smith called mental mutilation. There is a problem with this pin story though. Smith didn't actually observe pin making. It was an example he borrowed from another economist, and the fact is that although these days we tend to see Smith as a witness to the Industrial Revolution, this revolution took time. It wasn't a single event that you could simply observe by being there on the day it happened, and although Smith is still famous today, there were plenty of other people writing about what was going on, drawing similar conclusions at the time, because the fact is, everyone could see that something was changing. For one thing, factories were popping up all over the place, and individuals and banks were queuing up to invest, as for the first time in history, money was making money, for reasons that we'll cover in a minute. So, you didn't need to be an economist to see that something was afoot. In 1700, there were thought to be at most a couple of hundred manufactories, usually just a workshop attached to a mill, when by 1800 Britain boasted over 20,000 proper factories. You couldn't miss this. There was probably a factory at the end of your street, and if you weren't off fighting Napoleon in the early 1800s, then you were probably working there. Wales had more than its fair share of this increase, and its population of both factories and people grew fast in the 1700s, as its abundance of coal and iron pulled factories towards these essential ingredients of industrialisation, as they were heavy and difficult to move about. Weight is an often overlooked factor in the Industrial Revolution, and for an example of why it mattered, we need to look no further than Merthyr Tydfil. The idea that machines could travel across the ground and thereby carry things around seems very natural to us today, but back in the late 1700s, when the Frenchman Junot and then a little later the Cornishman Richard Trevithick tried to build machines that would crawl along the ground without blowing up or stopping every few minutes, you'd have to say it was a strange obsession. After all, what's wrong with horses? Indeed, none of the first generation of machines that travelled across the ground were as reliable or as fast or as cheap as a horse. Trevithick hadn't designed his machine to go on rails, but the weight meant that although he managed to make a prototype that worked well, it chewed up roads. Even worse, it blew up. But that got his name in the newspapers, and it wasn't a design fault, but due to the fact that he and his mates were in the pub at the time waiting for its steam boiler to heat up. Samuel Homfray thought that this might work to haul iron to the Penydarren ironworks in Merthyr that he owned, having read about this in the newspapers. It was already done using wagons running on iron rails because iron ore is so heavy, and up to then it had been pulled by teams of horses. What made Homfray so keen to mechanise this is not clear, but he was always looking to get one over on his competitors, and he wagered 500 guineas with them that the Trevithick train idea would work. In February 1804, Homfray won his bet with Trevithick's train carrying 10 tons of iron and 70 passengers on the Penydarren tramway, in front of a large group of onlookers, assembled press and local dignitaries. It was the first of a mode of transport that was the hallmark of mass travel during the Industrial Revolution, the steam train, despite later claims by Robert Stephenson and others to have invented this, which, to be fair, were justified to some extent, since Trevithick's train didn't work very well for long. Not his fault though, it was just that the cast iron rails they were using weren't up to the job. Without wishing to be too obvious, it can't be denied that for trains and almost everything else that came to the fore in the Industrial Revolution, coal and iron were essential. After all, although officially the Iron Age gave way to the Roman Age in the 17 and 1800s, iron is still the main metal for things other than jewellery and coins, and coal is the best source of heat and energy, as although windmills and water wheels are used to grind wheat, in terms of power generation, there's no contest. So although engineers recognised that the Romans had already solved the problem of moving large heavy stuff like coal and iron around, to and from factories and to and from major ports, with a single horse able to pull up to the equivalent of 15 elephants along via canals, in the end trains won out, as steam could do the same thing much faster. So while the Industrial Revolution relied on building canals in the 1700s, in the 1800s and into the 1900s it was all trains. There's a dark side to the Industrial Revolution, and I don't just mean all the soot and pollution that factories and trains created, but because an element of enslavement rears its ugly head again. The stealing of land from the poor came back on the agenda, ostensibly to improve agricultural production to deal with the growing population, but which, by happy coincidence for those who had other assets such as land and capital, it forced those that didn't off the common land and into the towns and cities and factories. These enclosures, as they are called, had been happening for centuries. The difference now was that it was by decree of the UK Parliament in London rather than royalty. Governments willing to do this to their own people, unsurprisingly, had few qualms about exploiting those from other countries too. And the expanding British Empire, which in the 1700s included huge swathes of the world, including America for a while, Canada, the Caribbean, parts of Africa, and of course the jewel in the crown, India. One of the interesting developments in this worth mentioning is the collaboration in this between governments and private firms, as India was governed with the help of the East India Company, which was by far the most successful firm the world has ever seen. Although by the 1800s it would be eclipsed by other firms built on manufacturing, as Britain became the workshop of the world, as the saying goes. Sadly, the reach of the empire meant that Britain was in an ideal position to take the middleman role in the transnational slave trade, supplying slaves not just to the colonies but to the whole world, although direct slavery within Wales and the rest of the UK was small scale, as the law wasn't clear on whether it was allowed or not, until it was clarified in the 1770s that it wasn't. And when the trade was finally banned in the 1800s, it was the scope and power of the empire that ensured that the ban was largely adhered to. You might think that with the empire supplying all kinds of resources, population growth contributing to even greater demands, heavier things like coal and iron being readily available close to home, and a technological revolution underway, all the elements of an industrial revolution were in place. But there's an essential piece of the jigsaw puzzle that's missing, and that's money. We saw in our first podcast that the Celts used metal bars and later coins for facilitating trade between tribes. We assume that within the tribe this was less of an issue. We all like to do favours for each other, and we don't need to tally this up too carefully, unless there's a dispute. Money had some purpose, therefore, for your average Celt, but probably not much. For kings, however, it had a bit more going for it, and we saw that with the arrival of the Romans, it could be used to control everything and everyone. But when they screwed that up, the control evaporated. The empire fell, and money went out of fashion in Wales for a few centuries. The fundamental problem with money is that money is an invention, and even though it's often described in weight terms, with pounds, rubles, marks and shekels, all originally being measures of specific constant immutable weight, money isn't like that. It's a variable, and that means it's only useful to the extent that people trust that it won't vary too much. And under the Romans, that trust was lost. With the Normans and later the Tudors, trust in it was restored, and it once again served to give power to the state. It would seem crazy, therefore, for the head of that state to give that power away, but that's exactly what King George III did in the middle of the 1700s. You may be thinking at this point that this may be one of the reasons that he was known as the Mad King. However, while he did occasionally exhibit signs of being mentally as well as physically unwell, and while our American cousins might bear a grudge against him, his decision to give away much of the power that controlling the creation of money confers is seen by many as a stroke of genius. The reason that George allowed control over Britain's money supply to shift to private banks was that it worked. It worked for them, by allowing them to keep just a fraction of money ready and waiting for customers while lending the rest to businesses, and then counting all money deposits in a bank as new money, even though it might have been lent by the same bank earlier in the day, meant that the banks could make money on the difference between how much interest they pay you for deposits and how much they charge for loans. The problem with this is that it allows banks to literally make money, with the King's printers having to print as much as the bank's deposit balances say people are allowed. And obviously there's a risk in that. If all the customers of a bank want cash at the same time, the bank will collapse. And if it's big enough, they could all come tumbling down, like they nearly did in 2008. To deal with this, the Bank of England was tasked with stepping in on behalf of the government to print as much money as the banks might need in such situations. So the Bank of England went from a private bank to essentially a part of the government. This arrangement also worked for borrowers and economic output by funding new businesses and innovations. And it worked for savers who, rather than pay for the privilege of having their money kept safe and secure, were being paid to deposit it by banks competing for their cash. Lastly, but not leastly, it also worked for the king, as fighting Napoleon had led to a national debt that was about 2.5 times the size of national output in a year, whereas today it's about 1 times, and the banks were happy to lend this to government, although in the government case it was for interest-paying IOUs like government bonds and treasury bills, which can be subdivided in a way that a simple loan cannot, which makes them more practical than just accumulating loans, especially when you can't offer collateral on the loans, as that would mean selling Britain, which is unacceptable, although you can of course sell it bit by bit. The name Bank of England is a bit misleading though, as its powers cover all the nations of the United Kingdom, including Wales, that also benefited greatly from this influx of cash, since it had very similar advantages to the north of England, and in terms of the availability of coal, iron, copper and slate, it was, if anything, even more blessed. The first two being particularly important as in combination they make the wonder material steel. It wasn't that steel was a new invention. Some Roman swords were made of it, or partly, and they knew it was stronger and more rust resistant than iron. But it wasn't until the 1800s that it could be reliably made at scale, and once it was used for pretty much everything. Although later the Port Talbot steelworks would become the world's largest, in the 1800s this industry was largely focused inland, with large plants in Merthyr Tydfil, Rhymney and Ebbw Vale. Apparently still such an impressive sight in the 1940s that it inspired Tolkien to think of the Land of Fire, Mordor, in his Lord of the Rings story. The number of people employed in this single industry in this small corridor at the top of the coal mining valleys was by the late 1800s around 30,000, not counting all the work that was associated with supporting such massive enterprises. The scale of coal mining itself dwarfed even this, however, as coal wasn't just used to make steel, but used for energy, for all the trains and power stations that powered all the factories, and also used to heat every home, and coal gas for cooking and street lights, and in all kinds of chemicals. You can even still buy soap made from it, as coal tar is good for the skin. Consequently, in Wales, around 200,000 men went underground to get this stuff by the end of the 1800s, in shifts that would last between 10 and 16 hours. And until 1842, they would have done it alongside women and small children, whose job might be to sit in dark tunnels and open and close ventilation traps, or lead the pit ponies. After 1842, however, children under 10 and women were only allowed to work above ground in carrying and sorting coal. Hacking coal out of rock with a pickaxe is never going to be easy, but add to this how stiflingly hot mines are and how dangerous, despite the best efforts of another inventive Cornishman, Humphrey Davy, who developed a methane detector that is actually a light. A naked flame to detect an explosive gas seems like a bad idea from the start, but Davy made it work. So rather than go bang in the presence of methane, all that happens is that the flame gets bigger and bluer. And it also lets you know if the oxygen levels are low as it dims and eventually goes out, by which time you hopefully got out yourself. The other danger is that in the long run, the coal dust that you're covered with by the end of a shift will kill you. And it's probably no comfort to know that you are powering a revolution. And it's certainly no comfort to know that the profit that you're creating is being extracted by the people who own the land that since Tudor times you've been dispossessed of. And make no mistake, in the case of mining in the 17 and 1800s, mining is largely unmechanised, so your effort is far and away the biggest source of profit. To be true to the subtitle of this podcast series, I should also add that much of this money was going to England, both on the basis of land ownership, but also because the supply chain for pretty much everything is completely integrated between Wales and England by the 1800s. Although many of the market institutions that we now associate with London today were at this time as likely to be found in Cardiff as London, particularly exchanges for coal and iron. So it wasn't that Welsh capitalists were being excluded in any kind of racial discrimination. It was just the way capital accumulation works. Indeed, much of the capital and large parts of the land in Wales, as much as anywhere, was owned by families that could trace it back to Norman times or the patronage of the Tudors, despite the increasing churn and turnover of fortunes that the Industrial Revolution created and the celebrity of some of the new industrialists and inventors. Another factor at play in the Industrial Revolution was that although in the last episode of this podcast I said that the basis of capitalism was established under the Tudors in the codification of rules and laws that applied to everyone including kings and queen, I think it's true to say that Britain had relatively few restrictive trade laws compared to other countries, allowing businesses to grow freely and to fail as markets moved on, and there was something of a political consensus about this at the time and about how best to support industry. This is not to say that it was a time of political stability, however. Even after the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, Britain was often at war, although not within its own borders, despite coming close to revolution no less than 3 times in the 1800s, including with the Chartist movement revolts in which Wales played a significant role, with their secret meeting place, for example, in a cave on Llangana Moor, with this Chartist cave, as it's called, being still very difficult to find without GPS. It can also be argued, of course, that wars that don't destroy a country actually often help it, economically speaking, in terms of encouraging innovation and invention, and, in this case, of creating demands that only factories and machine technology could meet, such as for guns and ammunition, much of which relied on mining and manufacturing in Wales. For example, while everyone knows about how a small force of Welsh soldiers kept a large army of Zulus at bay at Rorke's Drift, few people would know that the lead shot they used to do so also actually came from Wales. Again, thinking about the subtitle of this podcast, we need to think about where the money went and also where it comes from, as by money, what I sometimes mean is not literally cash, important though that is, but all things of value. This, however, raises the thorny question of where value comes from. Value is hard to measure, but it goes up because more land is being used, or more capital, which might be financial, but also includes machines and buildings are being added to production, these being what the capitalist in the business owns, or more people or more work being added, or that the efficiency with which these are used goes up, profit being simply the difference between the value coming out of a business minus what goes in. And there is no doubt that during the Industrial Revolution, entrepreneurs, innovators and engineers were adding more value to the pot, and therefore some of the profit could be attributed to their efforts too. There is, however, during this period, no doubt that the exploitation of the land, or at least what was underneath it, went up, as did the exploitation of labour, since workers lost their land and property ownership rights. And you don't have to accept the views expressed by Karl Marx in the 1860s that labour exploitation is the only source of profit to see that in this period it definitely was the major source of profit. Before we go, I'd like to point out that this episode, like all the others, is a personal view, And with something as complex as the Industrial Revolution, there's always different ways of looking at things. And as I think back to what I've just said, I'd just like to add a couple of points of nuance that often get overlooked in such debates, and which I'm in danger of overlooking in my approach. The first is that by starting in the 1700s, I haven't shown how this revolution evolved from developments made in the 1600s. We've already looked at how the Tudors oversaw the development of capitalism and made invention and innovation profitable, but it's also worth considering an example that illustrates the depths of the technological links too. If, for example, we look at the steam engine, we will see that something that was a toy in ancient Greece became a useful pump in the 1600s and a much more efficient and useful device that by pumping more rapidly can do all kinds of useful things like make the wheels on a train go round in the 1700s, and it was that James Watt invented. Similarly, the very idea of science that gave rise to many of the developments and improvements seen in the 1700s can be traced back to the 1600s. Francis Bacon, for example, writing in the early 1600s, had been very influential in promoting the idea of testing and experimentation, in contrast to the existing Aristotelian belief that if you just sat around thinking about it, that would get you the answer. The second thing is that I've mostly been talking about supply, and I feel that maybe I should end this episode by looking at the importance of demand too. Consider printing, for example. In the Middle Ages, writing was done by scribes. A lot of it in England and Wales involved creating copies of the Bible on parchment, which is, say, animal skins, with beautiful illustrations as an act of religious devotion. Speed and mass production was not required. Then, by the 1400s, rag and bone men collected used linen to use instead of animal skin, and there was even some proper paper making going on, which all meant the price of books and pamphlets could come down, and a few more began to circulate. Then came movable type printing, which William Caxton brought to Britain from the continent at the end of the 1400s. A few more things got printed as it made printing easier, but it really wasn't until the 1600s that sales really started to grow, when the church's power over what got printed was reduced by Henry VIII, and there was an increase in variety, and crucially because more people could read. In fact, it is estimated that the number who could rose from less than 200,000 to more than 2 million in Britain by the end of the 1600s, for two reasons. Firstly, because the population had doubled, and because, secondly, a greater proportion of them could read, following the Reformation that put the emphasis on the need for individuals to read the Bible themselves rather than rely on priests to do it. In the next episode, we're going to look at the end of the Victorian era and the rise of the welfare state.